Some folks seem pretty upset over this Connecticut Sun sale situation. I can't say I am one of those folks that is pissed off about it, but here is some of the reaction that you've seen. Senator Richard Blumenthal, WNBA put a full court press on blocking the Sun from staying in Connecticut. Deeply harmful to fans that live and breathe basketball. DOJ should investigate and stop such anti-competitive interference. Look, let's unpack this for a second, right? So the Connecticut Sun, we're going to be sold to one of the owners of the Celtics, right? Like, that was...
DeWanna Bonner didn't just hear the news. She felt it like a gut punch, a deep betrayal from a franchise she gave everything to, as the Connecticut Sun was suddenly treated like a disposable asset, sold off with no regard for the players or the loyal fans who built its identity. And what made it even worse was the league shutting down what many believed was the one opportunity to actually elevate the team. This wasn't just about ownership changing hands. It felt like a direct rejection of the explosive momentum surrounding stars like Caitlin Clark, a moment where the sport should be accelerating, not hitting the brakes. And from Bonner's perspective, it looked like the WNBA front office actively blocked a transformative deal that could have kept the team thriving in its region, turning what should have been a milestone into a statement that cut deep. This wasn't business as usual, this felt personal, like a message to players and fans alike that their investment, their passion, and their loyalty could be overlooked in an instant.
Let's unpack this for a second, right? So the Connecticut Sun, we're going to be sold to one of the owners of the Celtics, right? Like, that was agreed to. And that I get. Like, Boston, WNBA team, Boston sports fans, region remains the same, even if it's a different location. Like, I understand, I guess, being pissed that didn't go down. As far as the Connecticut Sun themselves, I don't think that team had much juice relative to the rest of the league. Let's just be real about it. It was not a destination.
Now picture this, a staggering $325 million offer on the table, a game-changing opportunity that could have reshaped the future of the franchise. With a connection to ownership from the Boston Celtics ready to inject major market energy, resources, and visibility into the team, a move that players like Bonner saw as a long overdue step into the spotlight the league keeps promising but rarely delivers. Yet instead of embracing that future, the WNBA responded with a firm and calculated rejection. Arguing it bypassed the traditional process while overlooking the reality that a passionate regional fanbase was already in place, hungry for growth and a modernized experience that actually matches the elite talent on the court, turning what should have been a defining leap forward into another frustrating reminder of how complicated and controversial the business of basketball can really be.
It was not a destination. It was not one of those teams, you know, if you're another team, you get excited about playing, you're circling on the calendar. And the facilities were not up to par. They're sharing courts for kids' birthday parties and stuff like that. And in this new CBA, that's part of it, is making sure all the facilities are up to par. So just keeping it status quo, I get why that wasn't the case. Just even moving, somewhere in Connecticut, Hartford was another suggestion. But with the ownership change could have been the upgrades. So that's one argument.
Behind the scenes, the situation surrounding the Connecticut Sun has become increasingly difficult to ignore, with conditions that feel far from what you'd expect at the professional level in today's game, especially as the rest of the WNBA continues to evolve and raise its standards. Yet here, players are still navigating shared spaces and limited resources that make it nearly impossible to sell a true vision of the future to incoming talent, and for veterans like DeWanna Bonner, that contrast is frustrating, because while the league is experiencing a surge in attention driven in part by the massive spotlight around Caitlin Clark, they're left operating in an environment that feels outdated and restrictive, creating a growing disconnect between the level of talent on the court and the infrastructure meant to support it.
Putting in that bid. But you can see the other side of it as well if you're, I think, fairly looking at it. The WNBA's case would be that they tried to skip the line, more or less. That's essentially what they said. Sun ownership, however, initially reached a deal last summer to sell the team for a record $325 million, which, by the way, needs to be appreciated. I think that the price here is $300 million to go to Houston, to relaunch the Comets, which I haven't even mentioned up until this point. And there's some history there, of course. But just the fact that the Connecticut Sun are selling for upwards of...
Instead of leaning into opportunities like a potential expansion into a market tied to the Boston Celtics, the WNBA appears to be shifting its focus toward reviving the Houston Comets with a reported $300 million relaunch, a decision that, to some, feels less about following the current momentum of the game and more about aligning with established NBA ownership circles, particularly with the involvement of the Tillman Fertitta family, and while Houston undeniably carries historic significance in women's basketball, the move raises tough questions for loyal supporters in Connecticut, as it creates the impression that an existing market, with dedicated fans and players like DeWanna Bonner still invested in its future, is being overlooked, leaving many to wonder how decisions like this fit into what is supposed to be a bold, forward-looking era for the league.
Which I haven't even mentioned up until this point. And there's some history there, of course. But just the fact that the Connecticut Sun are selling for upwards of $300 million is one of the surest signs of growth of the league that there's been, right? Like, I think they might have been bought for $10 million or something along those lines. That's an explosive growth. And it's one of the arguments I made going into the CBA as to how you can say, where the trajectory of the WNBA is headed beyond just simple revenue, net revenue, game in, game out.
The situation has escalated so far that even political leaders are now stepping in, turning what started as a basketball controversy into something much bigger, as Richard Blumenthal publicly pushed back against the potential unraveling of the Connecticut Sun, calling for aggressive action to protect the team's place in the state, and even floating the idea of involving the Department of Justice to examine whether the WNBA engaged in anti-competitive behavior, and when a sitting U.S. senator is openly discussing legal pressure over a franchise decision, it signals just how deeply this issue has fractured trust, transforming it from a league matter into a broader debate about control, fairness, and who really gets to shape the future of professional women's basketball.
Teams that have put bids in, that have gotten rewarded for doing so. WNBA effectively blocked the deal from progressing, holding firm that relocation decisions are made by the WNBA Board of Governors and not by individual teams, and that cities have already gone through the expansion process, which included Houston. Those cities have priority over Boston. And we know we're getting Cleveland. We know we're getting Philadelphia. Obviously, the Tempo, Toronto, and Portland are entering this year. And now you're going back to Houston. Now the cynic could say it's the Fertitta family, right? And the NBA rewarding one of its own because...
From the league's perspective, the WNBA maintains that its expansion process exists for a reason, insisting that every potential market, including one tied to the Boston Celtics, must follow the same structured path already navigated by cities like Houston, Toronto, and Portland. But for players and those closely watching the situation, that explanation doesn't fully land, instead feeling like a convenient shield against accelerating change, especially when the sport is experiencing a surge in visibility and momentum, and in their eyes, it sends a frustrating message to the Connecticut Sun that immediate opportunity and growth can be sidelined if it doesn't align with a slower, more rigid long-term plan, leaving uncertainty about whether waiting your turn will ever truly pay off for the roster as it stands today.
Priority over Boston. And we know we're getting Cleveland. We know we're getting Philadelphia. Obviously, the Tempo, Toronto, and Portland are entering this year. And now you're going back to Houston. Now the cynic could say it's the Fertitta family, right? And the NBA rewarding one of its own because of the Houston Rockets connection. The Sun will play one more season in Connecticut before relocating in 2027. So I sit on the side of, I understand why the Sun are being moved. I understand why this is happening.
To truly understand the frustration, you have to look at the numbers, and they are nothing short of staggering, because the Connecticut Sun was originally purchased for what now feels like a bargain, around $10 million, only to see its value climb past $30 million, a surge driven not by luck but by years of commitment, sacrifice, and performance from players who carried the league through its quieter eras, and now, just as the spotlight intensifies in what many are calling the era of Caitlin Clark, with new revenue streams and massive attention flowing into the WNBA, there's a growing sense among players that the very people who built this foundation are being sidelined from shaping its future, watching valuations skyrocket while being denied influence over ownership decisions, creating a tension that feels less about growth and more about control over who ultimately gets to benefit from the league's long-awaited breakthrough moment.
Connecticut before relocating in 2027. So I sit on the side of, I understand why the Sun are being moved. I understand why this is happening. I like the idea personally of a team in Boston more than a team in Houston. But the moral of the story is the demand. And you had teams that have put in for these bids, like Houston, and they're getting rewarded, and other teams wanting to get in on the WNBA business. And ultimately, I think that's...
This entire controversy is unfolding in the shadow of upcoming collective bargaining negotiations, raising the stakes to a level that goes far beyond a simple franchise sale, as players across the WNBA push not just for a larger share of the revenue but for real influence over how their teams are run, and when the league blocks a high-profile ownership path tied to the Boston Celtics, it sends a message that player preference comes second to the authority of the Board of Governors, something veterans like DeWanna Bonner recognize as a dangerous precedent that could reshape free agency and player autonomy for years to come, because if the league can dictate where a franchise goes, then the idea of player choice starts to feel more like an illusion than reality, especially as critics question the relevance of the Connecticut Sun, fueling even more fire for competitors who have spent years building that team into a consistent contender, only to see it treated as expendable despite proven success and investor interest. And now with a looming 2027 relocation tied to the revival of the Houston Comets, the situation creates a lame duck atmosphere where every game is overshadowed by uncertainty, draining the culture and loyalty that once defined the franchise, while accusations of anti-competitive interference continue to swirl, especially with the involvement of figures like Tillman Fertitta, highlighting deeper concerns about the league's ties to NBA power structures and whether decisions are being made for growth or internal alignment. And at the center of it all is the undeniable impact of Caitlin Clark, whose arrival has transformed the league's economics, driving ratings, ticket sales, and franchise valuations to new heights. Yet instead of lifting all teams equally, that momentum is exposing fractures, as the league prioritizes expansion into new markets over strengthening existing ones, effectively placing teams like the Sun and their loyal fanbase in a position where their past contributions are overshadowed by future projections, creating a harsh irony where a franchise valued at record levels is simultaneously being told its current home isn't good enough, leaving players feeling like assets in a larger corporate strategy rather than stakeholders in the sport's future. And as the expansion queue grows with cities like Toronto and Portland, while others like Cleveland and Philadelphia wait in line, the question becomes impossible to ignore. Why prioritize potential over proven success? Why trade a dedicated market for an uncertain one? And why enforce standards like upgraded facilities only to use them as justification for relocation instead of investment? A contradiction that players see clearly as they juggle competing at the highest level with advocating for their own stability, turning every game into more than just basketball, but a statement of resilience in the face of a system that feels increasingly controlled. And ultimately, this isn't just about the sale of the Sun, it's about a league at a crossroads, trying to balance explosive, player-driven growth with centralized control, where the frustration of Bonner and others reflects a deeper disconnect between those who power the game and those who govern it. And as 2027 approaches, the WNBA faces a defining question. Can it build its future without undermining the very foundation that got it here?